In this lecture, we're going to test attributes. The next test we'll write will check if a component can render a dynamic attribute. Most of our tests have been checking the inner content of elements. But what about attributes? Testing attribute should only be performed if the attribute is dynamic. You shouldn't be testing attributes that are static. We don't have many attributes in the application that are dynamic. We'll create one as an example. Open the song item component file. We're going to assign a dynamic ID attribute to the list item element. We'll use the ID of the document to help us generate the ID. On the list item element, bind the ID attribute. Set it to the following: song ID song.docID. We're going to write the test in the songitem.spec.js file. We have a test that takes care of mounting the component. We can copy this code to test the attribute. Let's make a copy of the test function. We'll change the description to the following: renders song.docID in ID attribute. The question I get asked often is, why are we mounting the same component twice? It's a fair question. In truth, we can move the wrapper variable up one level to the describe function. This adjustment will allow every test to use the same component. Here's the problem. Every test will rely on one instance of a component. This makes things difficult to refactor if we ever need to. If one test makes a change to the component, this can affect other tests. It's recommended every test have its own instance of a component. Therefore, we may mount the same component multiple times. This can slow tests down, but generally, it's considered worth it for more accurate test results. I'm going to undo this change. In the second test function, we'll make a couple of changes to it. First, we'll update the song object that's used as the prop. We'll change the display name property to the docID property. Its value will be ABC. Lastly, we'll completely replace the test assertion. We'll call the expect function. The test we're writing will check if the ID attribute is being set. We'll need to provide the expect function with the ID in the component. We can access the attributes by calling the attributes function on the wrapper object. The attributes function returns an object of attributes in the component. We can access any of the attributes in the object by their name. We'll access the ID attribute. Next, we'll chain the toBe function. The value to pass in will be song ID song.docID. We're finished. Let's run the tests. The tests will run without a problem. There are a few things I want to point out before we move on. Let's go back to the editor. First, the attributes function we're using will retrieve the attributes on the root element of the selection. It will not retrieve attributes that are in children elements. In the test, the wrapper will represent the component. It'll retrieve the attributes on the root element of the element. In this example, it would be the list item element. If we were to move the ID attribute to the composition element, this would cause the test to fail. I'll run the test again. The test fails as expected. This is important to understand. If your test for attributes fails, then you'll want to make sure you're selecting the correct element to begin with. I'm going to undo the change I made. Another thing I want to point out is how to handle the class attribute. Vue's testing library comes with a function for retrieving values from the class attribute. Let's refactor the test to check for a dynamic class. In the template, we'll need to update the attribute in the component. We'll change the attribute from ID to class. Next, we'll add another class attribute, except this time it'll be static. Its value will be example. Vue will merge the classes together. This merge will make things a bit more difficult because the class attribute can have multiple values at any given moment. Luckily, the libraries we're using accounted for this. Back in the test file, we're going to comment out the test assertion we've written. We're leaving it in for example purposes. We'll call the expect function again. This time we'll pass it in the wrapper.classes function. The classes function will return an array of classes. The class attribute is still accessible via the object returned by the attributes function. The main difference is that the attributes function will return the attributes values as a string. The classes function will take the time to convert the classes into an array. This can make it easier to test. We'll chain the toContain function with the same value we passed in the previous test. The toContain function can search both strings and arrays. If the array contains the class we're passing in, it'll pass the test. Let's try rerunning the test. The test will pass. Fantastic. That's how you would test attributes in a component. When writing tests for attributes, make sure it's for dynamic attributes only. If an attribute is static, there isn't a point in testing it.